Welcome back to J Painting. I say back, I assume you've been here before by now, but anyway, if not, welcome. So what happens on this here channel? Well, we talk about the hobby, of course. Sometimes it's tips and tricks of how to play the game or how to paint the models. Sometimes it's book reviews. Sometimes it's a retrospect to the hobby itself. Sometimes we take on the lore. Sometimes it's a drunk and explain. There's a bit of something for everyone, so I'm sure there's something for you personally here. Am I right? Well, let me know in the comments below. Anyway, so today we're talking about something which actually is kind of for new people, I suppose. It's stuff that if you've only been playing since 8th and 9th edition, you wouldn't have known. So it's all the stuff from the previous editions, some of the key stuff anyway, that hasn't translated over into 8th and 9th, which we did see up until 7th edition. And for today, painting this model right here, whilst we reminisce, take a stroll down memory lane and talk all about the things that if you're a new player to the hobby, you won't know. And this is where you get to all call me a boomer, because I remember those. I was very young when I played the game and this stuff was around, so I'm not saying I'm that old. But in any case, let's crack on. So the first thing I want to say is that new players will never remember or know is templates. I know they still exist in the Titanicus game, and I think there's a couple of other games that still have templates or template equivalents, but they really are a thing of the past in terms of 40k and Age of Sigmar as well. And to me, that's a bit of a shame. They were always something which was quite a nice and satisfying thing to get when you can get an entire unit under the large blast template or under the flame template. And when they scattered off, literally, they would always be a massive frustration. And for those of you who remember the days of 3rd and 4th edition, where if you were wholly under the template or partially under the template, and the arguments that caused is one of the reasons why I personally don't really miss them. But I can see at the same time why they went away, to be honest with you. And on that note as well, I think blast weapons and weapons of their type are something the Games Workshop to this day struggle with. They had the templates for one thing, but the templates were obviously just an extra thing to carry. They were something that you needed to have as a vital thing in armies such as Astra Militarum and even Space Marines in order to use your army properly. And if you didn't have them or you lost them, then you basically couldn't use your weapons. So I see why they got rid of them, because that's a limitation that you really don't want to have to deal with. But at the same time, there was something satisfying about them when you got it right. But at the same time, for newer players, not having to deal with templates does make things a bit more straightforward, even if the blast weapons are a little bit, for want of a better word, Byzantine in terms of how those rules have come about. Not everyone likes them, but at least it's more straightforward than, you know, having to position a template on the scatter dice. And that brings me on to my next thing that people nowadays will never know, the scatter dice. Oh my good lord, the scatter dice. Directional dice, I do actually understand why they got rid of those, because it may look like it's one direction to you, but to your opponent it looks like in a completely different direction, depending entirely on where you're standing. And it was a very inexact science, and I understand again why they got rid of that. But at the same time, there was still something satisfying about getting a direct hit with anything, whether it was deep striking or a blast weapon such as a frag grenade or even a battle cannon. But let's be honest here, at the same time, it did slow the game down quite substantially when you couldn't agree which direction things were meant to be scattering in. And obviously then there was the modifiers as to how far you do or don't scatter in some cases as well. I also think it's worth remembering as well that for a lot of us players who used scatter dice and template heavy armies, is that it did always mean as well that your army positioning was something which your opponent had to take into consideration. The more spread out your units were, the less you got under the template, and you had to keep that in mind, which could always be something to slow you down. It was a very easy way of catching your opponents out, and it wasn't particularly fair on them ultimately, especially when they had no choice but to spread out as much as possible. But at the same time, I think it's probably for the best that they are gone as well, because they did slow down the game. Although I should caveat that with if you're playing the Horus Heresy game, which is still using the 7th edition 40k rules, you will still see dice and templates on the board, and, you know, good luck to those guys, because I don't understand how they can still have that in the game. But, you know, it's another one of those things which, from back in the day, was used for a long time, and then ultimately was gone. So, for those of you who are new to the hobby, just be glad in some respects that you don't have to deal with them anymore. And then the next thing players will never know, universal special rules. Now, strictly speaking, they do kind of exist in 40k, but not in any codified or any, shall we say, regularised form. Yes, lots of rules are the same, such as the Apothecary's Nath Curium and Rotten Resilience and Disgusting Resilience in the Chaos Space Marine Codex for now, where you do get 5-up rolls that allow you to ignore damage or ignore wounds, etc, etc, etc. Which, to be fair, is the same rule across certain codexes, or the Exploding Sixes, which has become shorthand for that, where a hit roll of a 6 automatically scores an additional hit. So things like that can be seen as universal special rules, because multiple armies do have the same rules. But the difference between armies having the same rules on paper in terms of what the effect of the rule is, but then every army having the exact same set of rules to draw from, is a massive difference. Because whilst, yes, an additional hit roll of a 6 on a splinter weapon and having an additional roll of a 6 on a bolt weapon, strictly speaking, is the same rule, the effect is ultimately very different because they're very different weapons. But back in the day where everyone had things such as counterattack or furious charge or stubborn or Soulfire, if anyone even remembers what that one does, or a lot of other universal special rules which were then matched up with armies that ultimately ended up playing the same because all of the special rules were the same. And this was back at the time where all the unit types were the same. So all infantry had the same move characteristics, all monsters had the same move and rules characteristics, bikes, jet bikes, all had the same stuff. So it meant that apart from cosmetically, all the armies played the same. And even though, yes, like I say, some of the rules are the same across armies, by putting them into the codexes rather than having them as a massive part of the core rulebook, it does give every army a bit more flavour, and it allows those rules to be tweaked and adjusted and placed in different areas than they would otherwise be. And also it does allow a slightly clearer sense of balance on the game overall. Yes, some armies would benefit immensely from probably having a centralised set of special rules that covered a couple of them. Looking at Space Marines and the Imperial armies, that would probably help them quite a lot streamline how they work. But at the same time, when you have rules from the old ways such as Shred, which would allow you to reroll wounds, or Fleshbane and Armorbane, because of how general those rules were, sometimes it was very easy for them to be exploited, and in order for them to be turned into very broken things, and those solid aha moments that you hear people talk about a lot in tournaments would be something which you'd see quite frequently. So overall, seeing the end of the USRs was probably good. And whilst players today will never know the very, very long section in the back of the rulebook, again, that's probably for the best, but I can understand for some people why they miss it, but ultimately, it's probably not the biggest loss in the world. But this brings me on to my next thing, which I mentioned there just now, is homogenized unit types. Yes, believe it or not, all infantry, whether you are a Grot, or a Guardian, or a Drakari Warrior, or a Terminator, all of you moved 6 inches. Now, yes, this was then compensated for in some of the universal special rules where you had rules such as Fleet, but fundamentally everyone would move the same. And then this brings me back to what I said earlier about the fact that when everyone's characteristics are the same and everyone's special rules are the same, it does of course mean that cosmetically, that's only where the differences lie. Yes, your strength and your toughness and your weapon skill and everything else like that would vary massively. I mean, Guardsmen still couldn't go toe-to-toe with a Space Marine, for God's sake, necessarily. But at the point that they are moving the same speed and they have access to potentially most of the same special rules, it really did undermine the unique opportunities that you could have from having different armies. And the other thing you have to remember about that is that that's also extended to bigger things as well. All tanks would move at the same speed. All the monsters would move at the same speed. All cavalry, all beasts, all the bikes were all moving at the same speed. Whereas now, even though it may only be 2 or 3 inches difference, it's still a massive factor at the point that you think that a Space Marine bike can move 14 inches, but an Eldar bike can move 18, if not more. And that's enormous compared to what it used to be. So whilst players nowadays will not know this, it's worth remembering that you do have much more variety in how your units operate in 40k than you would do before. And this also extends, incidentally, to Age of Sigmar. Whilst in Warhammer Fantasy, everyone did have their own movement characteristic, what they still did have was unit types such as cavalry or infantry or monsters or monstrous infantry or monstrous cavalry. And whilst there were more of them, and whilst it didn't do that much, it did still mean that because everything was categorized, it did mean that a lot of the things that you have in Sigmar now, which allow units to really take their own unique approach to things, you didn't have in Fantasy, where everything was still very much the same. Now, this brings me on to my next thing, but this is very much a 40k specific thing. Armor values on vehicles. I will say this, and I've said it many, many times before, I've said it in other videos, getting rid of the armor values on vehicles and giving them a strength and toughness and a save characteristic is better. It's fundamentally better, because whilst they weren't a bad mechanic, it meant that all of your vehicles were effectively taking rules from a different game almost. It very much felt there was a separate system that was very specifically designed to be a tank or vehicle combat game, and it was very much transplanting half of those rules into 40k and hoping it worked out. So whilst the strength and toughness system was very quick and very easy to understand as well, the armor value of a vehicle and the weapons you could use to damage it, and then what would happen if you did damage it or not, was very convoluted and very difficult. And also it was very much down to where you thought that you were facing. There was the armor values being front, side, and rear, and for a Space Marine vehicle, or a Chaos Space Marine vehicle, or even an Astra Militarum vehicle, these were quite straightforward. The front and sides of a Land Raider or a Leman Russ are nice and straightforward because it's shaped like a brick. However, when it comes to things such as Drukhari or Eldar vehicles, or even some of the Necron vehicles, how do we even go about determining what's the front and what's the side of one of those? So getting rid of those was probably for the best. And this brings me on, not quite nicely, to my next thing. Instant death. Instant death was the bane of many people's existence in old 40k, and it's probably for the best that it's gone away. Now, it may not feel like it's gone away, considering how high some of the damage characteristics of some of the weapons in 40k can be nowadays, but it's the difference between having to roll 2 or 3 dice to get 2 or 3 damage 2, damage 3 attacks through to kill your character, and only having to roll 1 dice and then you fail 1 save for your Space Marine character to lose 3 wounds, 4 wounds, or even 5 wounds at a time, and that would be the end of them. And it's very important to remember that this was something which you didn't have a lot of control over. Nowadays, you are rolling more dice, and most models have more wounds anyway. And even though most things do have more attacks, because of the way the save system has changed, you have a better chance of surviving it. Whereas back then, it was a case of either you did have a save or you didn't have a save, and that was it, which meant the instant death rule was something which got on a lot of people's nerves. But also, in this very weird juxtaposition of that, is that there were a lot of things that could ignore the instant death rule, or this special rule in the universal special rule called Eternal Warrior that negated instant death. So obviously it meant that if people could, they would fill their army with models with that, or their characters would have that, effectively meaning that instant death wasn't actually that particularly good. And you have to remember that back then there were fewer things with multiple wounds anyway. In fact, the only things that had multiple wounds were things such as Orc Knobs, or Tyranid Warriors, or Tau Battlesuits, but Space Marines, everything in the Space Marine Codex that wasn't a character, only had 1 wound. So ultimately, it was a very different time, with a much shorter range, or a much more narrow range of units that was actually effective against anyway to begin with. And then this brings me on to the last thing that we will never know if you're only ever played 8th or 9th, and that's characters in units. Yes, there was a time where characters could join units, and some special rules that they had would then affect the unit, and sometimes it wouldn't, so it did get a bit confusing, but it was quite interesting, and it was a way to protect your characters from being shot off the board. Now, obviously nowadays, with things like Lookout Sir and the Bodyguard units, there are ways to mitigate this anyway, but ultimately, for a big chunk of 40k's history, if you put your Space Marine captain in a tactical squad, he couldn't be hit until every single model in that unit was dead. This did, of course, mean that that unit was a target and would more than likely be blown off the board until you could get to that captain, but that's the same as it is today. But there was still something a bit more tactically viable and quite interesting about putting your characters into units and giving them different buffs and perks. But ultimately, which is why it's better nowadays, is that rather than it being able to affect all units within a certain area, it would only affect the unit that they joined, meaning that your character's abilities were far more limited, and this was at a time where characters had less abilities anyway. So, just to quickly sum up what we've talked about here so far today, templates and scatter dice, 2 things which used to be a bit of an awkward thing you had to carry around with you, and if you didn't have, could mean that your army becomes less effective because you physically can't use your weapons. The universal special rules and the homogenized unit types, which meant that most armies played literally with the same special rules as well as the same core rules. Instant death killing characters, vehicles that felt like they were playing in a different game system, and characters being able to hide in their units. But why am I making this video and talking about all this stuff? Well, there are reasons why we should be remembered. First of all, unlike the very recent decision to bring Old World back, Games Workshop has a tendency to leave its gaming history behind when it moves on. Now, in some respects, this isn't always necessarily a bad thing. Some mistakes probably should be forgotten, and we don't want to talk about them. But then again, at the same time, we should remember what this was like for posterity. Because I'm not saying that these systems were necessarily bad, and I'm just saying how much they've changed. But it's always worth remembering that for us as older players, that as time goes by, more and more of this will be forgotten, as Games Workshop is less likely to release older versions of 40k again. And the other thing to remember is that 40k has a long lineage, and the hobby is not stagnant. It is still moving. New things are being released, new rules are being changed. There are rumours that 40k 10th edition is already done. And I believe that, to be honest with you, or allegedly I believe that it's possible, a big chunk of it's already done. But this brings me on to my last point, is that everything we have now will eventually be past. I know that sounds very hippy-dippy, but it's true. All of the current codexes will eventually no longer be valid. All of the old rulebooks, the rulebooks we have currently, will no longer be in circulation, will no longer be accepted. And I think it's always worth remembering. It's good to keep hold of those older books, because it's good to sometimes go back and just play the old systems. They're not always going to be to your taste, and when you go back and play some of them, you can see why so many people quit the hobby between 5th and 7th. But it's worth remembering them, because sometimes they can help us know what we want out of the hobby in the future, and sometimes it can even help those of us who are going to be shaping the hobby in the future change things. I'm not necessarily talking about myself here, talking about Games Workshop here, but it's good to remember these things, because, you know, the hobby has a history. It's worth preserving that history, both for us and for the people who join the hobby long after we've left it. But anyway, let me know your thoughts below. What other things from the hobby that you miss? What are the old things that you would like to see return in some form or another? And what are the things that you think should remain dead and buried forever? Let me know your thoughts. I look forward to hearing from you. So, those are all the things from the hobby that have sadly, or not sadly in some cases, passed us by and have now been lost to the history books. But they're worth remembering for posterity, because we never know when some of them might come back and in what forms they may come back. But I thought for those of you out there who don't remember them or never encountered them, it's worth knowing that they were out there once. And for those of you who remember them, well, let me know in the comments below. And whilst you're down there, like, subscribe, all that good YouTube shilly stuff, new videos every week. Check out my website for the services I provide. Have a look at my Instagram for the sort of stuff I've been painting. And check out my Patreon if you want to support the channel. But thanks again very, very much for watching. Goodbye, and have a lovely day.